Now, please welcome to the stage Secretary John Tilley and our expert panelists.
Welcome to When Reform Meets Reality. The reality of today is that we've had a great conference thus far, and it could stop now. So bear with us. I would also suggest that the first moderator of the day, Roy Austin, a friend of mine, was actually mean, I thought. I'm going to be a kinder, gentler moderator. Listen, I was taught to respect my elders, Chief Chuck Ramsey, and he's not, I don't think he's that old and that gray. I'm a little younger and a little grayer than Chuck, for that matter, wherever you are, Chuck. But to say that you started your work on a stagecoach, that's uncalled for, Roy. But funny, nonetheless. Hey, before I forget this, Abby, who controls everything, I'm convinced everything, not just here, but everywhere else, has told me to make sure to, first of all, thank you for your feedback on the federal priorities, but also if you have suggestions, those who facilitated at various tables, I think I organized a couple of those ineffectively, but if you could get your suggestions to Abby or Charlotte or Adam or anyone on the team, that would be very, very welcomed as well. Back to reform and reality. We know what reform is. We know what reality is. It's the world or state of things as they actually exist, as opposed to an idealistic idea, and I'm reading exactly from Weber's here, of them. So we want to talk about both, aspirational and also the reality of things. Good ideas don't implement themselves. Even the best ideas for reform can run into a buzzsaw on the ground, barriers on the ground to this reform. We're going to start with exploring three types of challenges: the political and the legislative, the policy challenges, and the program implementation. And we're going to identify several things throughout this. We're going to start with my friend Lynn Engel, who I've known just long enough to poke at a little bit. We're not going to read his bio, but I know he was the valedictorian of his summer school, for one. And he is also much, well, you're actually much older than you look, but nonetheless, he's a vigorous guy that I've known for years. So with that, the director, good night, everybody. Listen, I got to do something. It's after lunch, and you're going to take a food nap in a minute, a coma many people slip into. The policy and campaigns at CGI is his bailiwick, and he's the director of those. And I've actually worked with Lynn, and he's an amazing on-the-ground and policy leader and thought leader in our country. So with that, Lynn, what happened in Utah and Alaska?
Well, thank you, John. I'll thank you more later.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So Alaska gives and Utah give us an interesting comparison of the effect of legislation and policy, good intentions, and crisis management. So I've got some notes here that I need to use to stay within my time. So facing significant prison population growth, stagnant recidivism rates, and poorly funded community-based rehabilitation services, Utah and Alaska sought and received support through the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. In addition to a growing prison population, Utah's crime rate was declining, similar to the rest of the country. However, Alaska was an outlier and was in the midst of increasing crime rates as it began its JRI process. After a year-long system analysis and policy development process, Utah passed legislation, House Bill 348 in 2015, and Alaska passed Senate Bill 91 in 2016. Both laws were seen as significant and comprehensive changes to the criminal justice system and were projected to have a major impact on systemic decision-making, prison population trends, and the allocation of criminal justice resources. Utah legislation was projected to reduce nearly all of the 2,700 bed growth and avert more than $500 million in additional costs. Alaska's comprehensive reform package, which combined sweeping changes to pretrial, sentencing, and release policy, was projected to eliminate all of the prison growth and actually decrease the current prison population by 13%. This would allow Alaska to shift resources from the hard costs of corrections into the communities. Soon after passage in both states, the reforms faced significant threats. In Utah, 9 months after House Bill 348 was enacted, a police officer was killed in a shootout with a parolee who had escaped from a treatment facility a month earlier. The media almost immediately found a disgruntled ex-probation officer who stated that the Justice Reinvestment Initiative and the resulting reforms have made it more dangerous for POs and law enforcement, and that the officer would be alive but for this effort. A few other voices joined the blame game, and within a few days, the media was focused on whether Utah went too far in reforming its criminal justice system and when it was time to go back to the policies that had been changed. In Alaska, property and violent crime, which had been on the increase prior to the passage of Senate Bill 91, they continued to increase. And some types of crime spiked in the year and 2 years after the reforms were passed. A number of legislators and several community groups blamed Senate Bill 91 primarily because of this significant increase in property offenses. The media quickly picked up this thread by focusing on isolated incidents, and the narrative, the Senate Bill 691 was failing the public safety test, was established.
Well, Lynn, we're going to come back to you in a moment, but I think, again, it sets up what we can talk about at further time and when we should know as policymakers or as folks to either cut and run or double down and make tweaks or just hang tough with something. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But our next presenter is Janelle Malone, who I've gotten to know as well as a member of CCJ, Victim Services Director at the Iowa Attorney General's Office. He's going to talk a little bit about a number of things, but to start out, the implications of domestic violence arrest, unintended consequences. So set the stage for us there, Janelle.
Yeah, now I'm concerned I might have sat in the wrong chair, so I don't follow directions very well.
That's right. You confused me, but go ahead.
Sorry. I was asked to talk about some of the unintended consequences that stemmed from domestic violence arrest policies, specifically from, or most of which developed from the 1994 Authorization of Violence Against Women Act. We saw mandatory arrest policies in most states, and what that really stemmed from law enforcement showing up in domestic violence situations and it being labeled a family issue and them walking away without maybe anything having been done, therefore in a lot of cases putting victims at greater risk. And some of the things that we've seen from that is that oftentimes victims are now arrested alongside the offenders. We've seen removal of children from the care of non-offending parents because they're being charged with failure to protect or something along the lines of child endangerment. We've seen an increase in arrests for young girls especially. I want to say it's about a 25% increase over the last decade, specifically brown and black girls, for familial violence, which I think was definitely not the intention of the original language. And we're also seeing law enforcement in some cases showing up or arriving to an incident and looking at that incident in a vacuum rather than looking at the trends and the patterns of behavior that have occurred in that household. So those are some of the things that we're seeing or we have seen since those mandatory arrest policies were put in place.
Thank you, Janelle. We'll come back to you in a minute for a couple of final questions. And to those in the audience, we will try to be done so we can leave 10 minutes for Q&A, so prepare your Q&A as we get toward that. We've got 25 more minutes before we hit that mark. Doug Marlowe, also an expert, clearly the chief of science, an expert in his field, law and policy for NADCP. Going to talk obviously about drug court fidelity. We've talked a lot about accountability courts in this field, but certainly in CCJ in our discussions and how effective they are, but also how things have changed and some of the things that states have done to adapt, that courts have done, that judges and those who participate have adapted. So what adjustments have states made?
So I'm the implementation person on this panel, and I'm sort of affectionately known as the PETA for the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, the drug court field. For those of you who don't know, that's the pain in the ass. And
we do now.
And I do that very well, thank you. And my job is to be an inside person who believes in the model, who people see as a friend and a supporter, but who's there to hold people's feet to the fire. Drug courts did not develop the same way most initiatives do. Typically, we have some statutory policy initiative, maybe a think tank, university group has a model, they want to put that into practice, and our job is to get practitioners to follow that blueprint. Drug courts developed on the ground. They didn't develop from us. And they developed, there were hundreds of them within the first 10 years. And they didn't develop, they had a general blueprint. Judges are in charge of accountability. There's treatment as the core of the intervention. It occurs in the community, use of sanctions or rewards. But beyond that, there was huge heterogeneity, no real standard. And that could have spelled disaster. Instead, researchers looked at all of those different policies, all those different practices, and said, we can actually do these sort of minimal, mini experiments, use that variability to do some post hoc testing, figure out what actually produces better outcomes. So we used that, what was initially a weakness, sort of a pandemonium to study what was going on. And that has led to best practice standards for our field. These are practices that research shows are associated with 50 to 100% better improvements in reducing crime, saving money in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. I just went off, didn't I?
You're back.
Am I back on? So, and now our job is to get drug courts around the country to adhere to these best practice standards. And that is not a small task. And so states are now working with us to do quality control, to do training, certification. That's really where we're struggling now.
Yeah. I'm going to stick with you for a minute, Doug, and go off script. So Abby and Adam somewhere are getting nervous when I say I'm going off script, but trust me, it's not going to be that far off script. And did I mention that Roy was mean? He also just completely cut off Grover Norquist in mid-sentence. I'm not going to do that today or anytime in the future, but Doug, to that, how can we appreciate, and there's sort of a three-part question, how do we appreciate and help electeds and policymakers understand what you've said, understand the successes, but also that these innovations take time and they need support for implementation. So how do we thread that needle?
My personal view is that we are all at fault for acting like advocates, acting like we're here to push our own beliefs and theories, and we come up with something we think is an answer to everybody. And there's no such thing as an intervention that works for everybody in all circumstances. Everything we do is an hypothesis, something that we believe and it should be testable, but we don't talk that way. And we don't educate policy makers that these are theories that need to be tested, fixed, adjusted on the ground. We don't do that, and we get very defensive. If somebody starts to attack one of our models, we fight back, and we try to cut those people off at the knees and shut them up. And that is the last thing in the world we ought to be doing. We ought to be testing hypotheses, acknowledging where we went wrong, where there's limitations to what we do, and we need to train policy makers to think like scientists. We should, as scientists, should not be thinking like policymakers.
Excellent. Lynn, I mean, same question. I mean, again, as you've traveled, I mean, how many states would you estimate you've worked in? So you've got a good basis, 13 or 14 states. Again, you've talked about Utah and Alaska, so not to pick on those you've worked with or to celebrate either one, but of all those states, what would be the lessons learned you could convey here about, again, the same question, how do you make them appreciate these realities?
I think Doug's point is important. This is, policymakers, legislators especially, think in 2-year cycles, maybe 4-year cycles if you're lucky. So what can you give? What can you give me in a 2-year cycle when I'm up for re-election, when my campaign starts? They want some impact. This stuff doesn't implement itself, as you indicated at the outset. It takes a long time to implement it. It's taken years for some of these states to move to a point where they can talk about sentencing reform or changing release decision making or using evidence-based practices, and it's going to take longer to implement this stuff effectively. Setting expectations with those who have to take a tough vote is hugely important. Implementation is the key to the success of any policy, and there is a sense, and we saw it in Utah and Alaska, that in one place there was an expectation that we just passed JRI, we passed a bill, flip the light switch, things will change, crime will go down. In Utah, the policymakers, in a maelstrom of bad press and a horrific crime, took a step back and said, we're going to wait until we get the results of the investigation. As a group, the leaders of the state said, we're going to hold our fire And the press was clamoring, what are you going to do? Are you going to repeal this? Is it dangerous for law enforcement now that you've passed this reform? They stood together, which is incredibly impressive in that environment. And they said, we're going to wait for the investigation. And then we're going to look at the data, because we arrived at this set of policies by looking at the data to see how we got into this fix in the first place. And we're going to look at the data to see what we can do to work ourselves out of this particular incident. And those are the things, I think, that if you're data-driven, you've got to be data-driven throughout your decision-making. Anecdotes are going to drive headlines. You've got to focus on the data, but you've got to also adjust expectations of lawmakers and policymakers. This isn't going to happen overnight.
And I think you said something profound about how these innovations take time and they're hard. This is hard work on the ground. And I recall one of the bills that we passed in my home state of Kentucky. We passed it during a special session, and it was close to midnight, and we had a number of people, the media, again, it was standing room only in a small, media room. Lights were shining, and the governor signed the bill and put it into law at that moment with an emergency clause. And a friend of mine and I who'd worked on the bill for 3 years looked at one another, and again, we were celebrating this and feeling good about ourselves. And he said to me, the stroke of that pen will not lead one individual to sobriety. It was a piece of drug policy, and it's been innovative, and it's been successful since then, but it won't lead one person to successful reunification with their family. And that's one of the messages today. I mean, that struck me, what he said to me. And now that I'm in a different role on the executive side of things, I truly understand how difficult that implementation can be, and I know all of you do as well. With that, Janelle, what message would you give, the same question, what would you give to those electeds to slow them down a bit and let them see that this is hard work and takes time?
I don't know that I can say it much better than these two gentlemen have already said, but I would.
We got time, though. We were actually ahead of
I
schedule.
know the clock is ticking. It feels a little.
It's okay. We're ahead.
Pressure's on.
We got to fill time now.
I would agree completely that the work and the effort that it takes to implement these different initiatives set us on this path as individuals who care and are passionate about the things that we do, to dig in when some of them aren't working. And so I do think just re-emphasizing the commitment to reevaluation, even as you're implementing and after, to make sure that you're still headed down the right path and that there haven't been other unintended consequences, that there aren't other things that we couldn't have possibly fathomed when we were writing those kinds of policies. That education is vital. And I also think that it's really important that in that research and data that we're talking about, who we're including in that, in making sure that the voices of those who are closest or impacted the greatest by those policies also have voices at the table. Oftentimes it ends up being folks that are at the top and are a lot more removed from what's actually happening at the ground level. And we have to include the voices of those individuals who are more impacted.
Sure, thanks, Janelle. That's a round of applause there. Lynn, let's come back to you for the last, at least formal question we have on the agenda, and then we may open it up early, or we may find things to talk about in the interim, and it won't be your time in summer school, I promise. But Lynn, what lessons learned? What's the takeaway? When do you know to stay the course? When can you advise those in states like Utah or Alaska or others, the other 11 or 12 you've worked in, to either stay the course or to just cut and run altogether, or to make tweaks, make revisions to what you have to better what's being done?
Don't cut and run, ever. I mean, there's a path to reform, and it's largely driven by the things we've heard throughout today. Starting this morning, there's a huge need at the state and at the local level, and obviously at the federal level, to take a closer look at our criminal justice system to see who is being incarcerated, who is not being served. Why are we now using incarceration as a default for criminal behavior, and criminal behavior that is largely driven by things that are need a treatment response, a behavioral health response? So that's the mission we're on. We're not going to leave that. It may not be the right time. There's been a lot of questions since Alaska. It repealed Senate Bill 91 last year after a very divisive gubernatorial race where the governor current governor, the person who won last November, ran on repealing this bill. That was his primary platform. I've never worked in a state where the governor made criminal justice de-reform a priority. And he won. And so, the table was set for this. There was some pushback. I went back to Alaska, so had colleagues who went back repeatedly. There was a ton of work done to get a different narrative out there to explain, this is what you've accomplished so far. Look at the data. Crime was increasing. Crime was driven by a lot of factors. Before you started this effort, those factors are still present. A diminished law enforcement response, very little funding for important services. Those things were present after Senate Bill 91 passed because it takes a while to implement this. It takes a while to put the resources where they need to go. Wish that weren't the case, but it does. It's just the mechanics. Utah didn't do that. Utah stopped and said, we're going to wait until we have a better idea of how this tragedy happened, and the fault of this tragedy was the person who killed the officer, was the person who put himself in that place. We're not going to blame a bill or funding decisions or anything. That was that instant. But there were things that needed to change, and so, our response was, here's the data of how this is being implemented. It's a long-term process. The policymakers involved got engaged in this. They saw that this was working. They recognized there were going to be bumps along the road, but they knew enough. They had gone through enough to pass this bill that they weren't going to roll it back. In the following legislative session, which began just weeks after the murder of the officer, there was not one repeal bill filed in Utah, and they have consistently moved forward with implementation. And in fact, a year after that, did juvenile justice reform work as well.
Is there a need, and again, any of you can answer this one, but again, since we're talking specifically about an overall reform bill, an omnibus package, is there a need to be more proactive in promoting the successes before something bad happens? And I'll give you an example of that. So in Kentucky, we had worked on a bill and passed a JRI package in 2011, and mandatory reentry supervision was one of those pieces of a larger omnibus bill. And we had the first 16,000 come through the program who were not paroled, but released early into a pretty rigorous reentry program. And 4 cases went awry. But we had nearly 16,000 who were, by and large, successful. We did nothing on the front end to promote that success, except we did talk about the annual fiscal savings. But I don't think, in retrospect, we did near enough to celebrate the successes of those reentering. And we're doing that now in our state to talk about reentry and all those successes. But do you think being proactive helps to buffer or to set a bit of a wall so that it makes it easier to defend?
Yeah.
And I don't even want to use the term defense. Go on the offense early.
Right. Take advantage of what other states are doing. It's largely what Governor Deal talked about this morning, of the states are the incubator. They're showing an example to the feds of what can be done. I think it's hugely important. And we're all, we're data-driven, research-supported. I mean, that's hugely important. But telling the story is vital. This has got to be personal. The story of Alice and what she talked about this morning, the personal stories are the thing that makes people stop and reflect on what this system is about and how they want this system to react. So we could talk about the data, the savings, how many people are cycling in and out, recidivism rates, but you've got to have a story. You've got to have people that can define that story for the average citizen, and that's a huge. That we don't do that well enough. I think it's starting now. I think what we've seen from FAM and the ACLU and other organizations since the Federal First Step Act, the telling of these personal stories is hugely important and has to be part of all of these discussions. While we're embedded in data and research, we have to bring it back to the people who are most affected and the potential that these reforms have on their lives.
Doug, I'll go to you next. Again, it's the same question on a different topic in a different world, but as it relates to drug courts and what you do, I mean, what's the big takeaway? When do you same there? When do you know when to stick with it or make revisions? Or again, I dare say trash it, cut and run. I mean, when do you know?
Well, I don't think trashing it and cutting and run is really an option for drug courts because we're pretty much everywhere at this point, part of the system. So the question is making them better. When you do medical research, you are required from day one to measure adverse events and serious adverse events and report them and determine whether they are or are not caused by your intervention and be upfront about that. If we're going to start thinking that way, then we have to be clear that every one of our reform initiatives that we suggest is going to have benefits and it's going to have risks. And there are going to be side effects, inevitably. And if we keep telling people you can have your cake and eat it too, you can reduce incarceration, you can reduce crime, you can improve everyone's lives, and all good things will happen, then when that one bad thing happens, it looks like we sold a bill of goods and it wasn't true. If we had said that we will be continuously monitoring this and adjusting our programs based on what we're learning about our mistakes, that is a way to prepare for the inevitable when things go wrong. Now, as far as state initiatives, I mentioned earlier, we've developed these best practice standards that were intended to be enforceable and measurable. We have created a standard of care for ourselves. And that's very dangerous because you have a standard of care, you can be held liable for breaching that standard of care. That was the intent. Means we are basically saying we are going to hold ourselves accountable the same way that we require our participants to be held accountable. Again, something that the criminal justice system does not do generally. And by the way, I would argue that most of the treatment systems we work with have little to no practical accountability. They make decisions, they do it, they are their own fiefdoms. And so I think the reality is that if we want to be a profession, a true profession, then we have to have standards of care, and we have to have ethical codes, and we have to have reporting requirements. We have to take ourselves far more seriously than we have.
Do you advocate for those to be placed in statute legislation?
Yes. And I advocate for appellate courts to overrule drug court judges that do things that violate best practices. I advocate for participants to have a cause of action against professionals in drug courts that violate the standard of care. I advocate for drug courts to lose their funding if they are not meeting some level of criteria. And that's why I'm the PETA, of the drug, because that's not a popular position to take, when people are working hard. But the reality is we all want our cake and we want to eat it too, and we don't want anybody to require anything of us in that context. We don't hold ourselves out as being potentially wrong and potentially responsible. And until we do that, I don't think people are going to take us seriously.
Where are we, Doug, in that regard? Again, without calling out any particular state, but just as you look across the country and look at that what you see as that kind of accountability, that kind of self-accountability to the system, where are we? How far do we have to go? Have we made progress?
In drug courts?
Yeah.
I think that certainly it's safe to say that out of the 4,000 or whatever drug courts that are out there, they are, for the most part, aware of the standards. They are, most part, aware of some of the key elements of those standards. I would say that probably in terms of actual compliance with those standards, it's highly variable. And I think that there's, and these are just, these are not real scientific numbers, but there's probably about 8 to 10% of drug courts out there operating in such a fashion that they should not deserve the term drug court, that they don't meet the floor, the minimum requirement for the intervention. Then there is probably another 50 or 60% that are functioning, but they need substantial improvement in order to hit best practices. We have 50% of drug courts roughly not using medication-assisted treatment as a blanket policy. It's unacceptable. We have African American, Hispanic males particularly being grossly underrepresented in a large proportion of drug courts. Unacceptable. Yeah. We have judges putting people in jail early in treatment for positive drug tests. That's what drug courts came here to stop doing. That's our raison d'etre. And yet there are programs doing it. So I would say with 4,000 drug courts, you've got 4,000 different practices taking place, and that's why we need the standardization. That's why we need to say, this is the minimum requirement to be a drug court, and this is what it takes to be a best practice drug court, and this is where you need to be working towards.
Do you believe we ought to pay an extra stipend? Like, for instance, I know Governor Deal was a leader in this field, accountability courts generally. We heard from him earlier. He's a big part of this organization. He talks, again, a lot about the success they've seen in Georgia, for example, and I think they paid an extra stipend up to, like, if somebody correct me, maybe $6,000 per judge to run those accountability courts, because many of them are doing it on a volunteer basis after hours. Do you believe we should work toward a system where it again, enhances or motivates certain judges to do that?
Well, those of you in the room who know me, I'm a behavioral psychologist. So yeah, I believe in rewarding good behavior and withdrawing rewards and sanctioning bad behavior. And so the answer is, if people are engaged in taking on those dockets and following best practices and achieving effective outcomes, their compensation should be contingent on their ability to hit those benchmarks. And if they're not hitting those benchmarks, it should be reduced accordingly.
Funny enough, he did mention during one of our meetings that some of those judges who were opposed to accountability courts, when they saw that there would be a stipend, were magically then good proponents of that kind of reform. So
everybody says
I'm not being cynical at all, but
everybody says internal motivation is superior to external motivation. I'm here to tell you there's no difference between those two things.
That's good. Janelle, tough act to follow in that regard, but again, as it relates to the topic and in your expertise, the same question there. How would you let these folks know what takeaways are important?
I think that we've learned a lot. We've come a long way, and I think that the victim service field especially has operated from a place of scarcity forever until the more recent years when we've seen additional federal funding come down. So I don't think that we've always been the loudest voice in the room when it comes to policy, and I think that oftentimes policy is made, again, by those who are detached from what's happening on the ground. So I guess I differ a little bit from you two in that I really am a firm believer that if we make that commitment to data and research in ways that elevate those voices of the people closest to what's happening, that if we are in fact finding that what we're doing isn't working, then we should be ready to cut and run. Because I feel like a lot of these situations that we find ourselves in now around policy have been because we've continued to dig in instead of really taking a look at how we've gotten to where we are. That's not to say that you can't weather some storms and that there aren't going to be negative outcomes at times, but I do think that it's important that if we're truly making the commitment to going where the data points you, that we have to be willing to say that we might have gotten it wrong.
I'm one of those who's guilty of again, picking up on the latest sort of trends, and I think it's fashionable now to say we should fail forward, fail fast, that we learn as much from our failures, which is true. That said, I want to put you on the spot. Can you think of something, since you talked about cutting and running, and one of the three who did, is there an example of that in your field where you've seen something that didn't work and you were able to deconstruct it and just, move in a different direction? And if not, it's okay.
Well, that is putting me on the spot.
You are, yeah.
Those are my notes,
Listen,
John.
I can go back to making fun of Lynn if you need me to.
Give me a moment. No. Honestly, under pressure, I'm certain there's plenty of things that we've done that we probably should take another look at. I think we've, by and large, we've done a poor job of serving those who are the most vulnerable. And I think that we're really paying attention to those kinds of things now. I think that we've done a great job. For once, I would say the federal government has really understood that sending some directives from top down has really been helpful to the field, expanding the possibilities of who we can serve and mostly who we define as victims from the get-go. That circle's been very, very small for a very long time, and we're starting to recognize that offenders and victims and all these other labels, they're not mutually exclusive. Those are folks that come from the same places. And I think that oftentimes these solutions have already been in existence and communities have been doing them for lifetimes, and they just haven't had the voice or the power or the connections to be able to bring those to the forefront and allow others to replicate what's being done. So I do think that now we're really seeing an emphasis on being more inclusive and having more voices in that conversation.
Excellent. We've got 11 minutes for questions, so we're make an executive decision that we add 1 minute to the 10-minute Q&A, and not everyone at once. Somebody got a mic out there. Again, as Roy said earlier, he can't see, neither can I, with the lights. Let's get some questions. As we welcome the first question, as I see someone standing up now, Janelle, I may ask you one more question. I know you'll hear from a number of folks in a moment, Governor Bevin from, again, my state again. One thing we're proud of when working with DOJ and VOCA, and I know some folks here, I know Kate Peterson is here from VOCA. Having said that, we're proud of the partnership with OJP at being able to, with their help and some of our own matching funding, to place victims advocates at each of our 16 state police posts. And is that an example of where you see the field expanding and expanding the definition of victim? And let me add another layer to that question. Do you see that as a holistic approach as well? We also have a program called the Engel Initiative in our state police posts, where those who are suffering from SUD, who are addicted, could come in and find treatment. So do you see that as a partnership?
I do. I think that the best thing that's come from the increase in VOCA and the expansion of the rule and who's allowed to provide services to whom and how, the best part of that has been the widening of that circle. We now have allies recognizing what services can do and that they're necessary early. And so it's, I mean, I don't think 10 years ago I would be sitting in a room with this emphasis on victim services like we even are today. So I think that, yes, I believe your initiative is wonderful. I think that there are so many others that could be highlighted and have been. OVC's done a good job of trying to promote what's happening in other states so that we can replicate it. But there are quite a few initiatives that are now being put in place that are serving those who need services most and who traditionally haven't had access. I had a great conversation at my table earlier about services for post-conviction, the needs around post-conviction and how oftentimes services stop once the trial's over, and how that's been one of the gaps in services. So I think that this is something that now we're starting to move towards what can be instead of what's always been.
Excellent. First question.
Awesome, thank you. Christina Hollenbach. I run a family office. I'm a private investor towards alternatives to incarceration. And one of the themes that we've heard throughout has been the financing of these programs. And in the county that I'm from, in Onondaga County in upstate New York, our formerly incarcerated credible messengers in the community, we call them OGs, they regulate the community's issues with police and such like that. They went to the county, they said, listen, these same folks are going through your doors every single year, give them to us for a year. And if we keep them out of prison, you can keep half the money, we keep half the money, and it's good. And in 1 year, they saved the county $8 million. They got $4 million investment into a formerly incarcerated-led community program that does the real work on the ground that oftentimes isn't touched by these financing. And so this example of outcomes-based financing as a private investor is something that I'm very interested in scaling, because if the incentive is always to fill beds, if the incentives are driven towards mass incarceration, we're always going to fill. So I'm wondering, for you all as practitioners moving this stuff into reality, how do we, as private investors, support public programs to flip the incentive structures and get towards the outcomes we're talking about, to also scale enough capital for you all to do the programs at scale that you need to do, and for the community to do the services that they know how to do? Because as was said earlier, the safest communities are going to be the communities that are resourced. And if you don't agree with that, why can't outcomes-based financing work for you? Thank you.
Well, I'm an advocate for it, performance-based funding, outcomes-based, and we heard from Judge Leifman about private sector investment in a community which returns to everyone. But I'll start with our panelists. I mean, who wants to jump in? Raise your hand. Doug? You look like you're ready.
On the question of performance-based
Are you for it?
contracting?
Are you for it? And is there an example of it? And how would you see it applied to your world?
So I actually did a study when I was at the University of Pennsylvania. We did a study in Delaware where they put performance contracting in substance abuse treatment programs, not the criminal justice system. The modal attendance at substance abuse treatment in this country is 1. The most people will attend a single session. So they basically said you will get 80% of your contract value as a guarantee, and then you can earn up to 110% of your contract value if you can increase the mode to 4 sessions, and if you could extend the length of stay to 90 days, which some research suggests is a sort of a minimum period, right? And lo and behold, tenure rates started to increase because the incentives are, when does a treatment program get the most money? On intake. I do a bunch of assessments, I can bill for those assessments, I can do whatever. Then somebody doesn't come back, doesn't matter because I have another intake. And so all of the monetary assessments, I'm not sure this is the question that's being asked, but the whole system is not geared towards outcomes. Same thing's true in medicine. We're all hearing this now in terms of the healthcare debate. People are paid for delivery of services regardless of the quality or effectiveness of those services. And the criminal justice system makes the other systems look like they're doing an extraordinary job.
Yeah.
When in terms of we deliver quantity,
All
not
about expectations,
well,
as we said earlier.
Yep. I mean, we're not held accountable for our outcomes.
Either of you want to add to that? Or?
Yeah, I would say in the victim service field, it's been a tremendous gap because most of the funding that they have doesn't allow for it. So it's been a relatively new kind of change, especially in VOCA, where we can do performance evaluation, but even then, the pressures that exist at the state level and the politics that surround the funds make it very difficult to divert any funds towards program evaluation versus towards more services. So it's kind of a push-pull. I would say if there's a way, I think what I heard you ask is, how can private entities better support? I would tell you research is one of those places. In my state, we're working towards developing outcomes and service standards for different types of crimes so that we can measure that. I think for a long time, programs have been incentivized to count heads, and that's how they've been funded. And we don't really know if victims were better off for having encountered the services or not. And so I do think that that's been a shift, a more recent shift. But I think that's a great place to be able to support services. I would also say some of the programs that I've encountered that are doing the best work are ill-equipped to handle the bureaucracy around federal and state funds and are always looking for a greater pot of unrestricted funds from private entities that doesn't come with all of the red tape that we are forced as state administrators to pass on. So I definitely think there's probably a combination of those things.
Excellent. Lynn?
I agree with both of these things. And I think the public-private partnerships are a huge opportunity, and there's we've seen it more locally. It may be harder on the state level, but I think locally we've seen some very interesting opportunities where private funding has come in and helped drive outcomes. I think there's been, we've talked about implementation, how difficult that can be. I think you have somebody who comes in from outside with some level of expertise with funding and to incentivize certain outcomes and certain behavior. You see a very different level of intervention, of involvement at the local level. The folks who are there to implement something all of a sudden have a lot more motivation to move this thing forward. And so we've seen that work effectively in a couple of instances.
Got about 3 minutes for other questions. Anyone? Yeah, listen. I'm going to put somebody on the spot. Jay, it could be you. I see you back there trying. Now you're trying to hide. Don, anyone? We've got a question right here. Jerry Madden.
Thank you, John. I'm retired.
The correction is Jerry Madden from Texas. All right.
Glad to see everybody. A question, real simple, I think. Are there specialty courts in the federal system?
Are there specialty courts in the federal system? Yes, they generally follow that. They're usually based on people who have been released on probation, post-release, supervision. The research on the federal courts, very sort of a reentry model, has not been as favorable as it has been in the state model, and a lot of that appears to be failure to follow the model. So again, it's sort of a model integrity issue.
Are they all drug courts?
I can't hear you.
Are they all drug courts?
Are they all drug courts?
Well, mostly drug courts, but also now veterans treatment courts are becoming more. They're more, but it's mostly drug courts.
Yeah, we've got a minute. I'd ask Doug quickly. We talked about drug courts. I think we've talked a lot about the need for mental health courts. Obviously, the need for more mental health services, clearly across the board. But as it relates to other accountability courts, mental health, veterans courts, other specialized areas, what is your take on that in the next minute?
In terms of effectiveness?
Minute and 23 now.
So the first issue is that whenever programs decide to take on a new population, there's this natural instinct to say, everything that was learned in a previous population doesn't apply to my population. And so you see a model degradation as you move from population to population. So, for example, juvenile drug courts, which have really failed to follow the model, largely speaking, have also been ineffective, largely speaking. Mental health courts have done a better job of following the model. Family drug courts have done a better job, and they're more effective. Veterans treatments courts, the research hasn't really been done yet, but I have some serious concerns about the targeting issue, whether they're bringing in the right people, developing the right services. And so it's until we see some data, it's hard to know what the effectiveness are. Meanwhile, they're growing at 1,000%, literally, in terms of rate of growth. So sticking to the model, following best practices, instead of having it like the criminal justice system is like the wind and the ocean. It just erodes all progress if you give it enough time. And so you just got to constantly,
That's a That's fantastic.
and so you just have to be constantly on guard to the reasons to ignore science and go back to old habits. And that's.
And like George Costanza, you need to go out on top. So we're leaving with that one. So let's thank Lynn, Doug, and Janelle for When Reform Meets Reality.